When a petty dispute broke out between some small-time suburban criminals over $1,200, nobody would have expected the fighting to escalate up to kidnapping, much less murder. More so, nobody could have foreseen the years-long international manhunt or eventually how it would all come to an end. It's not at all uncommon for wealthy suburban teenagers to get into petty crime as a little form of rebellion. Most of the time, though, it won't go beyond anything that might risk them getting some significant jail time. Every once in a while, though, these young people will take it much farther than anything you might expect. So let's start at the beginning of this story. Susan and Jeff Marowitz were living a pretty good life back in the 90s. Living in the West Hills area of Los Angeles, Jeff worked for his family's company producing components for aviation. Susan stayed at home, playing the role of the housewife. The two had a daughter and a son from Jeff's previous marriage, as well as another son that they had had together. Their oldest son, Ben, was always in trouble. At the very least, he was always trouble adjacent. His parents said that he was a tough kid to have around, being that he was always up to something. They came to blame themselves, saying that they must have made some poor choices while parenting, but their other kids didn't end up the same way. Nicholas Markowitz, or just Nick, was more or less Ben's opposite. By the time he was 15 years old, his family said that he was turning into a pretty stand-up young guy. They said that he was funny, full of energy, and very into sports and theater at school. Jeff and Susan tried to help Ben, but they weren't really getting anywhere. Jeff hired him to work with him for a while, but that didn't do anything to keep him from acting up at home and getting into trouble with the police. They tried everything they could to nudge him onto a better path, but it just wasn't working. If anything, Ben's behavior was only getting worse. The two parents began to worry that Ben was going to have a bad influence on Nick, who still looked up to him. Jeff made the difficult decision to give Ben an ultimatum. Either he gets it together or he moves out. This was a decision Jeff would come to regret for the rest of his life, as making Ben leave only served to drive him towards his miscreant friends, one of which was a young man named Jesse James Hollywood. Before you ask, yes, that was his real legal birth name. Jesse lived only a few blocks away from Ben and his family. It wasn't too long before they became pretty good friends, if you could really call it that. Jesse had grown up pretty normally himself. Actually, he seemed to be doing a lot better than normal. He and his friends all grew up excelling in school and playing Little League together with Jesse's dad, Jack, acting as their coach. It never really seemed that Jesse was fated to get into any sort of trouble himself. After all, he was doing great as an athlete and attending El Camino Real High School, one of the best public schools in California at the time. All of this would change when Jesse started powerlifting. He began taking all sorts of supplements and working out around the clock to build muscle. This also gave him a cocky attitude, despite being 5'4" and 140 pounds, where he would stay. That attitude quickly became his downfall. His teachers began to describe him as being overly emotional. This culminated into what has only been called a violent fit in a rage when Jesse lashed out at one of his teachers near the end of his second year of high school. This got him expelled from the school entirely. Afterwards, Jesse started attending the Calabasas High School. He hopped onto the varsity baseball team there, playing until he suffered an injury that left him quitting the sport. Still though, he was able to graduate from this school without being expelled at least. While most of Jesse's friends ended up moving on to college, he decided that he wouldn't be making the same move. He decided to work on his own small business, selling weed. And business was booming, actually. By the time he was 19 years old, Jesse had paid a down payment on his first home in cash. With his little business growing, he decided to bring several of his friends on board. One of these friends was none other than Ben Markowitz. Life at Jesse's place was basically one big, never-ending party. All the group of friends did was lounge around, drink, smoke, and play around. Jesse would give each of his friends a little bit of weed to sell, and they would distribute the product all over the neighborhood. Once they got paid, they would bring the money back to Jesse. However, sometimes they would either trim a little bit off the top or smoke up a good chunk of the weed themselves and come up short on their payments. Jesse had let the power of this business go to his head. He started becoming more of a tyrant, and he wasn't going to stand for being short-sold. He would basically force these friends into slavery at his house to pay off their debt, making them clean up dog poop or beer cans from around the yard until he felt they had paid off what they owed. Given that many of these kids were outcast with nowhere to go and no other options for themselves, Jesse had a fairly easy time imposing power over them and taking advantage of them. One of the young men who came to owe Jesse money was Ben Markowitz himself. There was one difference with Ben, though. Despite owing Jesse about $1,200, Ben wasn't intimidated by his alpha male facade at all. None of the other men would stand up to Jesse, but anytime Jesse would tell Ben to pay up, Ben would simply tell him to fuck off. This left Jesse in a pretty tight spot. I mean, for one, he wanted that money back, and two, he couldn't have Ben making him look like a weakling. After all, if one man was simply able to brush him off and refuse to pay his debt, then what would stop all the others from doing the same? Jesse began to seethe in anger at Ben's refusal to pay up. He had to come up with some way to get Ben to pay off his debt. His first idea was to add more money as interest on top of the $1,200 that Ben had already owed. Ben responded in turn by chucking a brick through Jesse's window. This led to a few months of back and forth between the two men, with each upping the antics in retribution each time. This petty back and forth wasn't working. Jesse still didn't have any of his money. He was left with no choice but to resort to violence in his mind. So he and his crew set out to confront Ben directly. Ben's younger brother, Nick, was now 15 years old. To him, he felt that his life was very normal. However, on August 6th of 2000, he was taking a simple walk throughout his neighborhood, unaware that anything at all was amiss. That is until, by pure coincidence, Jesse James Hollywood and two members of his crew, Jesse Rugg and William Skidmore, drove by on their mission to confront Ben. They had prepared a van to kidnap Ben that day, but they had failed to find him. They stopped their car, feeling that an opportunity had presented itself. They decided that they might as well kidnap Ben's own younger brother and hold him for ransom. If they did that, they thought he would have no choice but to pay up. The three men hopped out of the van and charged towards Nick. Knowing that something was up, Nick made an attempt to make a run for it. It wasn't too long before Jesse and the others caught up to him, though. They knocked Nick to the ground, punching him and kicking him before picking him up and throwing him into the back of their van. They then sped off into the night, ready to send Ben Marowitz a message. Back home, Jeff and Susan had no idea that anything was wrong. After all, it wasn't unusual for Nick to walk over to a friend's house and spend a few hours there. However, after it became clear that he had been gone much longer than usual, the family started to worry. Susan had given Nick a pager. Whenever he got paged, he was supposed to head over to the nearest phone and call her. Any other time, he was very diligent about returning her calls. This time, though, she got nothing time and time again. Little did they know, this was because Nick was being held in the back of a white van, speeding north up the highway. Nick was finally let out of the van 70 miles away in Santa Barbara. He was told that he was being held hostage due to Ben's debt. However, once Nick was out of the van, they didn't treat him badly. In fact, they told him that this was all mainly for show. All they wanted was for Ben to pay up. They even gave Nick a Valium and let him light up a joint. Nick let his guard down pretty immediately, feeling that not only was this a cool experience, but he was the life of the party himself. Jesse's crew continued to fill Nick up with drugs and alcohol all night. He was surrounded at all times by at least 4 or 5 members of Jesse's extended posse, sometimes with a few hot girls talking to him at once, something he hadn't really experienced before. One of these girls asked Nick what was going on, why someone straight-laced like him was at one of these parties. Nick told her the whole story, saying that he was being held for ransom until his older brother paid off his debt. She asked him if he needed help escaping, but Nick wasn't at all worried. He told her, "Don't worry, everything's gonna work out." The party soon went mobile, with Nick being taken to several different houses throughout Santa Barbara. Some of these houses were the homes of younger teens who still lived with their parents. Several of these parents came to see Nick throughout his captivity, but none of them actually realized what was going on. Nick looked like he was just one of the guys. He never gave any indication that he was in trouble or being held against his will. If anything, it seemed that Nick was actually having fun and wanted to be there. For the most part, Nick was just lounging around and playing video games with the others. Back home, though, Nick's parents were in a frenzy. Jeff and Susan hadn't been able to get a hold of him for hours at this point, and it was now late into the night. It took a full 36 hours for them to finally get a hold of Ben and ask him if he knew what was going on. Ben told them that he hadn't heard anything from Nick either, leading the parents to accept that they had a real problem on their hands. They called the Los Angeles police, but by now, Nick was far out of town. It was now the day after Nick's kidnapping, and Jesse James Hollywood was starting to sober up. The reality began to sink in that he had committed a real kidnapping. He left Nick with the rest of the crew and went back home to the San Fernando Valley. He wanted to meet up with a family friend who was an attorney and have a bit of a chat with him about some hypotheticals. He told the man that there was a situation at hand. One of his friends was holding a kid hostage. Keeping the details vague, he asked how much trouble this friend might be in. This attorney got real with Jesse and told him that anyone directly involved in the kidnapping risked some serious jail time, even life in prison in some circumstances. Jesse seemed angered by this revelation and left the home in a huff. Nick, on the other hand, still wasn't all too worried. His partying would continue for the whole day and into the next. Eventually, the crew took him to a hotel in Santa Barbara, the Lemon Tree Inn, for a pool party. There he got to meet up with a 17-year-old girl who knew the boys. He told the girl what was happening, seeming to find the whole thing amusing. He told her, "This will be a story I can tell my grandchildren," still completely sure that he would be returned home just fine in the end. He had no idea that Jesse was panicking behind the scenes, unsure of what to do with him. Jesse James Hollywood told Jesse Rugg and a few others that had been holding Nick that they would be sending him home. They told Nick that he was about to head home. They told him they would simply go out and buy him a bus or a train ticket and send him on his way. They said that they might even give him a little bit of money for his trouble. Little did anyone know at the time, Jesse James Hollywood didn't have any intention of going through with that promise. Jesse had been sweating bullets after his conversation with the attorney. He had decided that he couldn't risk Nick going back home and telling his family that he had been kidnapped. Jesse had an idea and called up one of his dealers that had basically been forced into indentured servitude at his home, a young man named Ryan Hoyt. Ryan was one of the men who was in the most debt to Jesse, something that Jesse felt he could use to get him on board with his new plan. Jesse met up with Ryan and threw a duffel bag at his feet. This bag contained a Tech-9 and some ammunition. The gun had been modified to the extent that it was fully automatic at this point, equipped with a stock and some other attachments as well. Jesse told Ryan that they had a bit of a situation on their hands and that solving this problem for him would be how Ryan would pay off his debt. Ryan, more than ready to get out from underneath Jesse's thumb, agreed to the plan without much of a fight. A few other members of Jesse's crew went out to scope out the mountains above the Santa Barbara area in order to find the perfect place to carry out their plan. They decided that they had no choice but to kill Nick in order to keep the knowledge of the kidnapping from spilling out. They settled on the Lizard's Mouth Trail in the San Ynez Mountains north of Goleta. There, one man, Graham Presley, dug a shallow grave. The rest of the crew then returned to the hotel to grab Nick. It was now 2.5 days since the kidnapping started, and they threw Nick into the van once again. This time, though, they weren't heading to another party. They were heading up to the mountains to the site of the grave. It's very likely that Nick knew something was amiss at this point, as the group made an effort to tie him up and gag him for this particular trip. They pulled Nick out of the car and began to walk him towards where Graham had been digging the grave. Nick was made to stand in front of his own grave, hands tied behind his back with duct tape over his mouth. That's when Ryan Hoyt picked up the shovel from the ground and took a hard swing towards the back of Nick's head. While Nick was stunned, Ryan then pulled out the Tech-9 and squeezed the trigger. In one short burst, 9 bullets left the gun and flew straight into Nick's back. The only reason that Ryan stopped shooting in the first place was that the gun had jammed. Nick then collapsed forward into the grave. Finished, the crew decided to ditch the gun as well, tucking it underneath his legs before burying him. The crew was more than confident that Nick's body would never be found in such a remote area up in the mountains. However, their inexperience and lack of knowledge about the area would prove to be their downfall. For one, the grave was far too shallow. It wouldn't be hard at all for the dirt to come loose and reveal what was hidden beneath. Second, the area wasn't near as remote as they had thought, actually being quite close to a popular hiking trail. It was only a few days later, on August 12th, that someone on the hiking trail came across Nick's body. Then, it only took a couple more days before his body was positively identified. After a week and a half of pure hell, Nick's parents heard the news that they had been dreading the most. Ben Markowitz heard the news while he was participating in the search for Nick himself. He broke down on camera, being interviewed by the KNBC News. He told them, "It's my fault that my 15-year-old brother is dead." A funeral was soon held for Nick, one that was attended by hundreds of different people. They all had the same question on their minds, and that was, who did this? Luckily for them, it wasn't going to be too long at all before the answer to that question became very clear. You may remember the young woman that Nick had talked to at the party, the woman who wanted to help him escape before Nick told her that it wasn't necessary. This woman first heard about what had happened to Nick when she happened to come across a photo of his face in the local newspaper. Both shocked that he was dead and infuriated that the crew had lied to her about their intentions, she decided to head to the local police immediately. Leads had actually already been pouring in left and right, but she would be the anchor that would help piece the whole story together. It was actually only a matter of hours before the police were raining down on Jesse James Hollywood's crew and making arrests. They quickly got their hands on Graham Presley, who dug the grave, Jesse Rugg and William Skidmore, who had assisted in the kidnapping, and Ryan Hoyt, the triggerman himself. However, there was still one man that they didn't have, Jesse James Hollywood himself. Jesse, back home, had either seen on the news or in the paper that a body had been found. Before Nick's body had even been identified, he saw the writing on the wall and took off. He left the area as quickly as he could, heading out to Colorado Springs, an area where his family used to live. There, he stayed with a family friend. However, by the time the police knew of this, he had already fled the area before they could grab him. Jesse then ran off to Las Vegas with his girlfriend, staying at a luxury hotel on the Strip. However, the police just barely missed him there too. He then headed back to the San Fernando Valley, most likely to meet up with his father, Jack. Jack knew of Jesse's predicament and hoped to help him flee from justice for as long as he could. Jack, along with his good friend and Jesse's godfather, suggested that he flee to Canada and then make his way out to Brazil with his girlfriend's help. Jesse's plan was actually a success. He had managed to flee the United States and make his way out to Brazil. Nobody aside from the 3 people who had helped him had any idea where he had gone, and they weren't talking. Jesse quickly made his way onto the list of the FBI's most wanted fugitives. However, they had absolutely no clue as to where he might be. Even after prodding the other crew members who had been arrested, it was pretty clear that they had no idea either. Whether they had Jesse in custody or not, it was time for the other boys' trials to begin. Susan and Jeff Marowitz attended each and every one of the trials for every day that they could. Each time, they were subject to seeing the gruesome crime scene photos of their son time and time again. Still though, they wanted nothing more than to see these young men's downfalls. Ryan Hoyt, the man who had directly killed Nick, would have the first trial. At the age of 20, he was facing a charge of full-on first-degree murder. It wasn't hard at all for the jury to come to a conclusion in his case. He was found guilty fairly quickly. He was convicted on November 21, 2001. A few weeks later, a decision was made on his sentencing. He was sentenced to death. Around this time, Unsolved Mysteries aired an episode featuring the story of Nick Markowitz's murder. The episode was aired with the goal that someone watching the show might know Jesse James Hollywood's whereabouts, but they had no luck in that regard. The story was also aired on America's Most Wanted multiple times, but to no avail. William R. Skidmore, also 20, was charged with both kidnapping and robbery in relation to the case. As a part of his plea bargain, he was sentenced in September of 2002 to 9 years in prison. Next came the trial of Jesse Taylor Rugg, who was also 20 years old. He was hit with charges related to aiding in the kidnapping and murder. He was convicted in 2002, charged with aggravated kidnapping for ransom or extortion with special circumstances. He was, however, acquitted on the murder charge. He was sentenced to life in prison, but would have the possibility of parole after only 7 years. Last was the trial of Graham Presley, who was surprisingly only 17 years old at the time of the murder. Given that he had only dug the grave in the killing, the jury had a bit more trouble deciding on what to do with him. In July of 2022, he was acquitted of the kidnapping. The jury was hung when it came to the murder charge. In October, he faced a retrial, during which he was convicted of second-degree murder. He was thrown into a California Youth Authority facility to spend the next 5 years in custody. About a year after that last trial took place, the Markowitz family won a lawsuit that they had started against the kidnappers, the killers, the man who had lent them the van in the kidnapping, and the homeowners of the parties where Nick was held captive. They were awarded $11.2 million in damages. However, even with all this, the family still couldn't rest. After all, it was now well known that Jesse James Hollywood had ordered the murder and he was nowhere to be found. Susan took it upon herself to further the search for Jesse in any way that she could, anything from placing wanted posters wherever she could over town or handing out cards with information to those in the community, either directly or by placing them under people's windshields. The detectives working on Jesse's case began to feel that his parents very likely knew where he was hiding. The problem was they didn't have any evidence for this. At the time, it was only a hunch. It was a correct hunch, but it was one that they couldn't back up with any hard facts. Without some sort of probable cause, they couldn't really even look into it. That is, after all sorts of different leads started pouring in from people who knew Jack Hollywood that stated that he, from hints in his conversation, very likely knew that his son was alive and well. Some even said that he seemed to know exactly where his son was. The FBI reached out to people all over the United States and even all over the internet as well. They offered a $50,000 reward to anyone who could provide information that would lead them to Jesse's whereabouts. With these wanted posters and Jesse sharing the name of the infamous outlaw, he gradually became somewhat of a legend. Still though, it would be quite a while before there was any real movement in the case. In fact, it would be a full 2 years after the murder before the police would get a tip that Jesse had gone south. Very far south. They all said that he was in Brazil, an area that had developed somewhat of a reputation at the time for being a safe haven for international criminals. Jesse James Hollywood had been making a life for himself in a rural area of Brazil. Adopting the name Michael Costa Guo, he told some people that he was a native of Rio de Janeiro. He told others that he was from Saquarema. He was able to blend in fairly well by learning Portuguese in a relatively short amount of time. At first, he made a very modest living by putting up posters and advertising for a local nightclub. Later on, he got a job as a dog walker and eventually started teaching private English lessons. Still though, most of the money he lived off of was the $1,200 that his father sent him every month. All sorts of tips about Jesse's location and activity poured into investigators. At some point, they had even heard that he had turned his life over to Jesus and was hiding out in a monastery of all places. So many leads came in that they couldn't quite pinpoint exactly where he was living. All they knew was that, in all likelihood, he was somewhere in the massive country of Brazil. However, investigators grew more confident in 2004. It had now been 4 years since the murder. The police made their way out to Jeff and Susan Markowitz's home. They told them that they were going to find Jesse James Hollywood. It wasn't a matter of if, it was a matter of when. Eventually, a number of tips led them to believe that Jesse was hiding in one of the areas that he had previously claimed as his hometown, the small beach resort on the eastern coast of Brazil called Saquarema. And they were correct. Just off of the beach, in a small home surrounded by a large wooden fence, was a man that the locals knew as Mike, the resident Canadian. This Mike was a man that the neighbors said kept to himself and didn't talk much. However, he was often seen hanging out with his 2 dogs and lifting weights on his front porch. Even then, though, he was usually seen wearing a baseball cap, keeping his head down and hiding his face. It was said that he even wore this cap low when he was inside his own house. Hiding his face had become somewhat second nature to him by this point. At night, Jesse, or Mike as they knew him, would grow a bit more bold, drifting around throughout the various different bars in the local area. One of these bars was only a short walk from his own house. There, Mike was known as a guy who couldn't shut his mouth after a few drinks. It was there that he met a woman 10 years older than him named Marcia Rice. He told Marcia that he was in Brazil to study. Marcia was quickly enamored by him, saying that he seemed to be lost. The two eventually started dating, and after a while moved in together at Jesse's home. Marcia said that, aside from the occasional bar fight, he was a pretty stand-up guy. She said that he treated her like a queen, always willing to rub her feet or treat her to a romantic dinner. They had a pretty good life, but it's very likely that Jesse was pulling off a scheme behind the scenes. Jesse had heard the story of a man named Ronnie Biggs, an infamous English criminal who fled to Brazil after a train robbery. There he utilized a local law that prevented fugitives from being extradited from Brazil if they had had a child with a Brazilian native. Jesse decided that this would likely secure his future, making him immune to the clutches of the FBI. The two lived together as a happy couple until one day in March of 2005. That's when Jesse got a call from his family, being told that one of his cousins would be coming down to visit him. Jesse was very excited to see someone from his family for the first time in years, more than ready to go and see her at a local coffee shop, even if it was only briefly. There was one thing that Jesse didn't know, though, and that is that the authorities in California had been on his trail for quite some time now. Jesse had allowed his mask to slip a few times while he was in Brazil. While he normally hid his face, he did allow his photo to be taken one time for a Brazilian travel brochure, completely unobscured. This, combined with many other tips, had the police hot on his trail, and it's believed that around this time they found probable cause to listen in to Jack's phone calls as well. They knew that, in all likelihood, this meeting with his cousin would be their perfect chance to grab him. Jesse went to the local mall to meet up with his cousin. He wasn't greeted by his cousin, though. Instead, a Brazilian federal agent walked up to his table. She calmly told Jesse that it was all over, that he was under arrest. The whole time, he kept telling her that they had the wrong guy. His name was Michael, and he had never even lived in America. She wasn't having it, though. The authorities in America had given her more than enough information to be positive that this was their guy. After nearly 5 years, Jesse was finally arrested for the murder of Nick Marowitz. He was taken into custody by the Brazilian authorities. On that very same day, the police in the United States made their move on Jesse's father, Jack, as well. They arrested him on charges related to the manufacturing of the narcotic GHB. However, that charge was later thrown out of court. Instead, he was held in custody due to an outstanding weed-related warrant going back to 2002. The reality is, the police knew that he was complicit and wanted him in custody however they could. Eventually, Jack was sentenced to 18 months in an Arizona prison. Jesse's girlfriend in Brazil, Marcia Rice, was left stunned after what had happened. She didn't know of Jesse's true past, having no idea that he had been part of a murder plot in a different hemisphere. She pled with the local agents to let this Mike go, saying that it wasn't possible that he was the man that they were looking for. It was during this begging that she revealed that she was pregnant with Jesse's baby and had been so for 6 months. Hearing this, the authorities questioned Jesse about the pregnancy. He admitted that he had been advised to take a page out of Ronnie Biggs's book and get a local woman pregnant to avoid deportation. It wasn't known whether or not he actually had feelings for Marcia or if he was only dating her with the intention of getting her pregnant. At the very most, he did have genuine feelings for her and decided to make the most out of the opportunity. There was a problem for Jesse, though. The laws had changed since the days of Ronnie Biggs. Jesse's plan would have never worked. Once it was found that he had entered Brazil using a fake Canadian passport, he was extradited from the country immediately. Hearing all of this, the Marowitz family was hit with a large wave of relief. Back home, Susan collapsed in tears. It was finally all over. But now that the search was finished, she was hit with the full force of the grief that she hadn't been able to fully experience before. In April of 2005, Jesse James Hollywood was finally arraigned for his crime in Santa Barbara. Denying his complicity at all, he pled not guilty to both the charges of kidnapping and of murder. However, it was revealed that, even though he wasn't even present for Nick's murder, he could still be facing the death penalty. In jail, Jesse started getting some letters. He signed his return letters under the name Alpha Dog, and even joked of one day starting an Alpha Dog World Tour. This brings us to the movie being made about Nick Markowitz's murder, one called Alpha Dog. Filming was already underway for the movie. Although it didn't mention any of the figures involved by name directly, the story was very heavily inspired by the events of the murder. The role of Nick, called Zach in the movie, was played by a young actor named Anton Yelchin, who had actually grown up in the San Fernando Valley himself. The Markowitz family was less than happy about the film. Jeff said that he feared this movie, like many others, would idolize the killer as some sort of anti-hero, cool, outlaw type of character. He wouldn't have been able to stand seeing Jesse James Hollywood being portrayed in such a way. He hoped that the movie would focus more on his son. Still though, both Jeff and Susan came around and went on to cooperate with the director of the movie and the actors on set. Susan even worked closely with the woman playing her counterpart in the movie. It was this work with those close to the case that would present a problem. One of the people consulted for the movie was one of the prosecutors in Jesse's case. This risked Jesse's trial being ruined by a very biased jury who had already heard the details of the case through the movie. Eventually, it was decided that that prosecutor would be let go from his role in the case. While Jesse was awaiting his trial in America, his son would be born overseas without him. Marcia named the young boy John Paul Hollywood Rice in memory of Pope John Paul II. She had wanted to name him after a good man, not after a no-good outlaw like his father had been. She superstitiously hoped that this might lead him to be a better man than his father. After Jesse was captured, Jeff and Susan felt that they could finally repair their relationship with their other son, Ben. Ben had become somewhat estranged from the family over the years. He was living in his own personal hell, never able to get over the fact that his involvement with Jesse and his crew had resulted in the death of his younger brother. Susan said, "Ben is really in his own hell. You know, he will never be the same because of his brother's death. I know that. I know he loved him. And if he had the opportunity to have made things different, he would have. It was a little strange at first seeing him so often, but the more I saw him, the more I realized that I did miss him." After years of waiting, Jesse's trial finally began in May of 2009. Both the Markowitz and the Hollywood families attended the trial every single day. Jesse's defense based their strategy around blaming Ben for what had happened. They said that Ben had been threatening Jesse's life for months at this point, saying that Ben had also poisoned his dog. Due to the grief over the dog, they say, Jesse picked Nick up on pure impulse. They said that the killing was performed without Jesse's influence at all, saying that his crew had done it of their own accord in order to fix his problems and win favor with him. The defense said that all of Jesse's cohorts had boldly lied about his involvement in the crime. The prosecution disagreed, saying that Jesse was a child killer. Jesse had been hit with 3 different charges, and depending on what the jury decided, he was looking at a very vague prison sentence, anything from 8 years to life in prison to a full-on death sentence. Still though, it only took the jury 3 days of deliberation to come to a decision. They found Jesse James Hollywood guilty of both kidnapping and of first-degree murder with special circumstances. This meant that he could very well be facing the death penalty after all, much like Ryan Hoyt before him. Luckily for Jesse, though, he was spared this fate. On July 15, 2009, he was finally sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. He will spend the remainder of his life behind bars. Ever since the release of the Alpha Dog movie and the ending of Jesse's trial, there have been many new developments in the case. A lot of the developments have to do with the prison sentences of the many young men involved in the crime coming to an end. Graham Presley, who dug Nick's grave, was in the California Youth Authority facility for years. Shortly before his 25th birthday, he was released. He was now a free man. William Skidmore, complicit in the kidnapping, was also released in April of 2009. He is also free as well. It seems that, by all accounts, he has maintained a very quiet life since his release. Jesse Rugg, the other one of the kidnappers, had been denied parole at his first hearing in 2006. However, after 11 years in prison, he was released in 2013, free to live a somewhat normal life, albeit as a convicted felon. Graham got married, dabbled in different careers in the local wine industry, and co-owned a bar. However, the bar later closed after many accusations of misconduct between Graham and his partners. He had multiple run-ins with the police over the years, but never was arrested. As evident by Graham Presley's online presence, he had learned absolutely nothing. Having a YouTube channel of his own, as well as a blog, he made his opinion clear about Jesse Rugg's release. He wrote, "I'm goddamn ecstatic. My boy is getting out. Coming home. He'll be on parole forever, but at least he's coming home. After, well, over a decade of pandering and speaking the truth my padre and his padre and everyone's fucking padre wanted us to spew, I can confidently say one thing, and very loudly. Fuck the police. You retards got it all wrong." Jesse Rugg, on the other hand, has expressed deep remorse for what had happened to Nick ever since his release. He hasn't had even one run-in with the police ever since he was released, vowing to never return to that life for the rest of his days. Jesse James Hollywood wasn't going to take his sentencing lying down. Over the years, he and his lawyers have continued to file for appeals in both his trial and his sentencing. In 2010, the judge upheld his sentence of life in prison without parole. In 2012, the court upheld his conviction and denied him a retrial. Jesse's lawyers continued to argue that Jesse was not guilty because Nick could have left his captivity at any time and chose not to do so, saying that this means that Jesse was never responsible for what happened to him after he left the party. While Nick will never get to experience a day of life again, the same isn't true for Jesse. Even though he's behind bars, his life continues. In January of 2014, he married a woman named Melinda Enos. Melinda had been writing letters to him in prison for quite some time. She said that the public is wrong about Jesse, saying that he is a very misunderstood man. The two were married at a small ceremony in the visitor's room of the Calipatria State Prison. Still, Jesse will never have an average married life. He will continue to remain in prison until his death. Back in Brazil, a young boy, now around 20 years old, is growing up without his father. Marcia Rice and her son have evidently decided to scrub their lives of Jesse's involvement. Hopefully, John Paul will live out the rest of his life as a much better man. Graham Presley, by far the least remorseful of all the young men, was diagnosed with cancer in 2021 and died the next year in 2022. And after all of these years, it seems that Ryan Hoyt will never face his death sentence after all. After years of appeals, in January of 2024, Ryan had his death sentence reduced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. Still though, in the end, both he and Jesse will live out the rest of their days in prison. Once again, thank you for watching my video. If you found it interesting, please give it a like as it really helps me out in the algorithm, and feel free to subscribe if you want to see more content like this. Now I've opened up a merch store. There you can get yourself some cool Dire Trip t-shirts or coffee mugs or something and help support the channel. If you want, go ahead and follow me on social media. If you never need to get a hold of me, that's probably the easiest way to do it. I also really appreciate when people follow me on Patreon. There you can get videos early, ad-free, and uncensored. Channel memberships are up too, and you can get the same benefits there as well. Once again, this has been your host Kyle. Thank you, and good night.